The speaker series is an initiative aimed for keynote speakers to lead discussions by addressing important social issues. Although this event will be different from the previous, as this time we have turned it into a panel with 3 guests, with each of them representing an Indigenous community. Our speakers today will discuss issues they're still currently facing and their take on spreading more awareness about Indigenous issues. As a disclaimer, we understand and want attendees to be aware that this is a sensitive subject matter overall, and many of the topics and thoughts presented tonight may be difficult for some of our viewers to process. With that being said, taking part in this panel is not easy on our speakers as it carries a large emotional price tag for them. By no means is this just another discussion for any of our panelists, because it's not something they just want you to listen to, but rather it's something they need you to hear, especially since they are in the middle of mass grieving. So to all our attendees tonight, we kindly request that you be mindful and respectful of that. After learning about the recent findings at the residential schools, I knew I wanted to do my part in increasing more awareness about Indigenous issues, and so I proposed this idea of an Indigenous-centered speaker series. Our hope tonight is that all of you will leave feeling inspired and motivated to further educate yourself and others in spreading more awareness on matters relating to the Indigenous peoples. During this time, we will have a moment of silence to grieve the thousands of unmarked graves of former residential school children. Thank you. Moving on, I would like to introduce our speakers for the evening, starting with Sandi Boucher. Sandi is a proud speaker who creates a safe space for Indigenous perspectives, healing, and reconciliation. Welcome, Sandi.
Miigwech, thank you so much.
Up next, I would like to introduce Samantha Mandamin. Samantha is a designated Aboriginal academic support advisor right here at Ryerson. Samantha is passionate about helping Indigenous students in their journey to achieving academic success. Welcome, Samantha.
Miigwech, thank you for having me.
And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Lorralene Whiteye. Lorralene is an Indigenous education coordinator at Humber College. Her work has allowed her to continue her passion in Indigenous education and advocate for the youth. Welcome, Lorralene.
Miigwech, happy to be here.
Thank you, everyone. The findings of the children were tragic and had the biggest impact on our Indigenous peoples. So before we start, we wanted to check in and see how everyone is doing mentally. How is everyone feeling today? I'll start in the order of my screen. So Sandi, if you wanted to start us off.
I think anyone who has ever lost a loved one knows about the waves of grief. One day you're fine, and then suddenly when you least expect it, you see an image, you read an article, you hear someone's comment, and you're right back at the beginning again. So I think not only does that describe how it feels for so many of us, but I think that's something that other people have to be conscious of. Just because we can have a discussion one day, you have no idea what has happened between times the next time you see us. So today, I'm in a good place. I'm looking forward to this discussion. And we pray that it just gets easier. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sandi. Samantha, if you wanted to go next.
Well, Sandi said it, really. Learning about like the mass graves, unfortunately, it wasn't anything that was really new because I was well aware of that situation before it became national news. And it's grief, it's sadness, you know, like it's horrific. It brings you down. And all you can do is just mourn the losses and find ways to stay resilient and find the little joys of happiness in your everyday lives, you know, especially if there's laughter. I try to embrace it as much as possible because it's one thing that really helps me get through all of the sadness going around our Indigenous communities. Miigwech.
Thank you, Samantha. And Lorralene, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I really want to echo what Sandi and Samantha both said. You know, grief, I think we've all felt grief in some sort of way at one time in our life. And I can tell you all right now, when the news first started coming out, and it was like I was on my social media and just seeing it again and again and again, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere. The news was being shared, and to continue to have to work in an office setting. And I was in a meeting the day after, you know, like the first discovery happened, and one of my teammates were, oh, like, Lorralene, what are your thoughts on this? Or what are your thoughts about this kind of programming? And I was just kind of sitting there, and I wasn't fully there because I couldn't focus. Everything was so blurred. And I still have those days. Today I'm in a good space, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation all together. And it's just a process that we all have to work through. You know, we're all on our own healing journeys, but like, again, all in it together at the same time. Miigwech.
Absolutely. Thank you all for opening up to us and sharing how you feel. We can't imagine what you're going through, but we hope it gets better for everyone involved. I'll move on to our first question for the discussion portion of the evening. And that'll be, what are some more institutionalized norms that negatively affect Indigenous peoples, some of which most people may not understand or exactly learn about? And we'll go back to Sandi in that same order.
I did not expect that, honestly. I thought one of the other panelists was going to speak to this question. So I don't want to take up the space. I can't remember which one. I know one of us had identified that they really wanted to speak to this topic. And respectfully, I would just love to pass the feather microphone to them to allow them to speak to it. Miigwech.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, Samantha, was that you that selected this question?
Yes. It is something that I notice very regularly. I was fortunate enough to have been raised within my First Nation community. And for myself, even moving into a city, I had experienced culture shock. And to understand some institutionalized norms that negatively affect Indigenous people, one thing that I really want to try and speak to is since becoming an urban Indigenous person, you know, living within a city environment, I always get asked a lot of questions, and I find I'm always teaching people. I'm always trying to teach them about like Indigenous people, reservations, First Nation reserves, politics around First Nations people, and it sometimes feels like it never ends. And even within my job at Ryerson as the Aboriginal Academic Support Advisor for all of our Indigenous students, I find that I'm still doing that even with other, you know, partnering agencies or staff on campus or other support counselors, individuals as well, having to like explain a situation. And just to give an example, I had been working with a student who had come to see me, and just due to the situation they were in, it was an unfortunate situation where they ended up not having safe housing. And I had to advocate to like an agency to try and see if we could get this student appropriate housing. And it was just like, oh, they don't fall under our policies for admitting people into our shelter. And I had to reiterate, and they wanted to just, you know, sorry, it doesn't fall under our policy, that's it. But I had to like really advocate for this student, because the person on the other end didn't really understand the seriousness of this situation. And I had to reiterate that to them. I had to tell them, listen, this is a serious situation. This student is visibly Indigenous. They are also female, and missing and murdered Indigenous women is not a myth. It's like a real issue. And this, you know, person is, you know, doesn't have safe housing. They're living out of their car in a dangerous area. Like, we need to find them a safe place. Like, and if you can't help me, put me through to somebody else who can help me, because this is something I see as a serious issue. And although you don't see it as a serious issue, you know, having to reiterate missing and murdered Indigenous women being a real issue is something that I find I have to teach people, you know, because some people don't understand that. They don't live in the lives that Indigenous people live in, and they don't know how difficult it is. You know, it's easy to say, oh, you're hurt, you're sick, go to a hospital. It's not that easy for Indigenous people to go to a hospital. And if any of you have been paying attention to the news, you might be aware of Joyce Equan, who was live streamed her death on Facebook. And she was telling the nurses, I'm allergic to morphine, don't give me morphine. They didn't listen, they gave her morphine, she died. She was a mother of 8. And this is like a real thing. So like, also policing, you know, if you're in trouble, call the police. Sometimes it doesn't happen. It's not a safe environment for Indigenous people. Colton Boucher, you know, the policing in Thunder Bay being investigated and found extreme racism. Like, these are institutionalized systems in place that do not work in favor of Indigenous people. And these are things that I think people should be learning about and educating themselves about, because when you're out in the field and you're helping and you're working in those environments, you should understand how detrimental it is for Indigenous people to go out and find the courage to ask for help from those service professionals, given the lack of trust, the history, the systematic racism, institutionalized racism that exists. You know, I think it's very important for people to learn about all of those things, because it has a detrimental impact on Indigenous people. Miigwech.
Absolutely. Thank you, Samantha, for sharing. I do agree. I think that systemic racism and institutionalized racism is often overlooked, especially when it does come to the Indigenous peoples. So thank you so much for shedding light on that and educating everyone on that tonight. I'd like to ask Lorralene, is there anything that you would like to add on that? Sorry.
Yeah, Miigwech, that was very, very well said, Samantha. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with that. You know, systemic racism and institutionalized racism, the systems that we work in, are that racism is so deeply rooted. And so the norms that we see every day are just, you know, that's what they become, norms. And with, specifically within the education system, within the post-secondary education system, I've seen a lot of our students struggling because a lot of people don't understand that us as Indigenous people, we see things and we view things differently and we learn differently. It's that whole concept of two-eyed seeing and living in two worlds as well. So there's the two-eyed seeing concept kind of as a whole is Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and seeing things. At Humber College, I took paralegal education. And so it's like working in the judicial system, working to become a paralegal or working towards becoming a lawyer. And I finished the program, but I remember within my third semester, my second year, and I was thinking like, I really don't like this. I don't like this work because of the way the legal system works against Indigenous people. And within the legal system, it was like as if they're teaching you, you have to be a shark. You have to be, you know, get out there and like get after people. But I'm like, me as an Indigenous person, I was always trying to see like the difference and trying to like level out the good and the bad. And I'm like, okay, well, I see it this way. And, you know, I was always like getting into arguments with my professors about that too. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't see it that way. And they're like, well, this is the law. This is the way the Canadian legal system works. And I'm like, okay. And, you know, and I always like encourage students to like challenge that way of thinking as well. Yeah, I think that's.
Mina, do you mind if I add to that?
Absolutely, Sandi. Take it away.
Okay, Samantha, beautiful job. Lorralene, totally agree with everything you just said. So I'm speaking to you from Thunder Bay, Ontario, and its reputation as anti-Indigenous capital of Canada is well earned. I don't know. Well, let's put it this way. I grew up in Northern Ontario. Moving to the big city was moving to Thunder Bay, which is hilarious for anyone in Toronto. Before, and I did live in Toronto for 5 years, but before I moved there, and this is total complete honesty, if someone had told me that there was such a thing as a non-Indigenous person who cared two beans about what happens to Indigenous people in Canada, I would have told you no such person exists. And that's what living in Northern Ontario taught me. Our hospital, I don't know if other hospitals have them, maybe they do, but here in Thunder Bay, we have Indigenous navigators. They're actually staff people in the hospital. So if you're Indigenous and you come in there, you don't feel like you're the only one because it's so terrifying. My son is now in his mid 30s. He's quite a bit darker than me. One of the most eye-opening and heartbreaking moments of our relationship was when he was probably about 19, and he shared with me that if he was ever in some kind of altercation and he was considering, someone was considering calling the police, that he would never do that because, as he put it, I know who's leaving in handcuffs, even if I'm the one that's attacked. It took moving to Toronto, and even though, as Samantha said, it gets so draining to be asked the same questions over and over on a daily basis, it took me moving to Toronto and meeting people that wanted to ask questions for me to realize other people in Canada do care. It was actually the basis for me becoming a motivational speaker. I came back up here so excited running into our communities going, it's not that they don't care, they don't know. They weren't taught about residential schools. They don't know what services are lacking in our communities, and they get really upset when we tell them. So, and that's why I wanted to be part of this presentation, because yes, there's problems and the institutions can be incredibly scary, but the solution are the people that walk in the doors of those institutions. And if you say, not in my city, not in my company, not in my office, then things begin to change. So, Miigwech.
Thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate all of you for opening up our eyes and really providing those insights for us. I'm sure a lot of attendees tonight may have learned a thing or two from those words. So again, thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to move on to our next question for the evening. And that question will be for Lorralene. Have you ever felt alienated by society or in general for being part of an Indigenous community?
Yeah, for sure. I think Sandi and Samantha kind of touched base on it. But especially coming from, I'm originally from Mandamin First Nation, which is up 5 hours northwest of Thunder Bay. And I always grew up like in my home community. You know, I was that little res kid, you know, like happy, like went to school up until high school on the res. And then coming to Toronto, I came to Toronto on a class trip one time. And I knew I wanted to move here, and I was like, oh my God, I'm like so in love with and so mesmerized by the big city. And then when I finally moved here for college, right after I graduated high school, and moving from a community of, I would say like 600 people to going to school at Humber College, which we have over 25,000 students. And it's like the biggest college in Canada. And that itself is overwhelming because it feels like a small city. But then living in Toronto, that's even a bigger step. And so I was like, I felt so, I didn't see any of my people anymore. I didn't feel comfortable a lot in my first year of college because I still didn't find the Indigenous Resource Center. And so I would walk through the hallways, like there would be like Indigenous art here and there. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And, you know, I would sit in those lounges where the Indigenous art was just to like kind of feel like some sort of normalcy, I guess. But yeah, that I really, really did feel alienated and just out of my comfort zone. I really felt like I didn't belong in these spaces, in these hallways, in this institution. And then in my second semester, I did find the Indigenous Resource Center and I did find like my people. And I was like, so like relieved by that because I was like, I can like talk about the experiences that I've had in my classes. Like I would say I'm recognizably Indigenous. And there was this one time I was like in the intro to Canadian law class, and I'm pretty sure I was the only Indigenous person in the room. And there was one paragraph within this textbook. And I remember the professor kept looking at me, saying like, oh, like the Indigenous people like help create Canadian law or something like that. Something along those lines. There was just a short paragraph and we had a break. And so I was sitting at my desk and I had my head down and I was kind of just like looking at my phone, whatever. And this professor would go around and talk to everybody and how are you doing? Good, whatever. And this was the first time he came up to me and he was like, was that good? And I was like, I don't know, I guess so. So it's like, and it's like professor, like, and it's those types of interactions that make you feel alienated as well. But I was like, when I finally found my people, I was like, oh my God, like you guys wouldn't believe, like this happened, this happened, this happened. And then, and so that's why I love working in post-secondary education, because I love connecting with the students and being like, how are your classes doing? Like, are you okay? You can always come to me if like, you know, something feels weird or something feels off, because we're gonna take care of it. And it's all part of that education experience. You have to even educate the professors and educate the deans and the associate deans. Yeah.
Thank you, Lorralene. Thank you for speaking on the lack of representation in our society. I can definitely agree with you in that our own education system definitely lacks in that it doesn't teach enough about Indigenous culture and Indigenous history, and that's from a non-Indigenous perspective. I definitely feel that our system failed to push forward that education. So thank you for sharing. I'd like to ask if Sandi or Samantha would like to add to that.
Sure, I'm going to jump in on this one. I just want to, great job, by the way. Awesome, awesome. That camaraderie, we in our planning meeting, it was like, yes, people who get it. It's such a relief. And you know what? I get asked all the time, and I know I'm going to see nodding heads when I say this. If it's so bad on the reserves, why do people keep going back? Right? Oh, right. Samantha's reaction was priceless, right? Why do we go back? Because we're surrounded by people who get it. For the first time, we don't have to explain how exhausting it is, even though there are so many challenges there and so much heartbreak, and so the services aren't there. People understand. I always say reconciliation is going to happen the day, one, that an Indigenous person can say no and it's actually listened to, whether that's a woman speaking to a non-Indigenous man or a community saying no pipeline. Yes, that was a shot at our government. And the other thing is the day we get to a point where it's okay for an Indigenous person not to know everything about Indigenous history, we stop getting called upon to teach our teachers. It's ridiculous. It centers us out. But what I wanted to touch on very briefly here, that alienation, I actually wrote about it in my second book. And what I called it was the hum. Anyone who's ever been in a room with a fluorescent light, you know, that god awful constant hum you hear in the background? That's what it's like, or at least it was for me and many people I know growing up Indigenous in Canada. There was almost this constant hum in the background that said, you'll never be accepted. You're never going to fit in. They're always going to judge you. Why even try? And I think it's so imperative. We were talking about students at Humber College. I can't even imagine that many students, or right, any of these huge institutions, for people to understand that just for an Indigenous person to walk in those doors is a huge achievement, because you are constantly fighting against that hum. To become a motivational speaker and tell myself that someone might want to hear my words required me to silence that hum and to fight against it on a daily basis. And it's reinforced everywhere. You turn on a movie, there's no Indigenous people in the movie, or they're stereotypical. It's a movie about Indigenous people, right? They're never just in a coffee shop or like we go to coffee shops, we buy groceries, but we're never just there. And it's this silent hum that, see, you don't fit in, you're not accepted. So if you know an Indigenous successful person, they climbed a mountain to get there that you can't even imagine. And that's what we go through every single day to remind ourselves we can do this. And not only that, that we have to, because other Indigenous people are trying to climb the same mountain. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sandi. Samantha, did you want to add to that as well?
Yes. I completely resonated with everything that Lorralene and Sandi had echoed here. Just a little bit about myself, that hum that you speak about, Sandi, I remember the first time I felt it, and I was just probably like 7 or 6 years old, and I was in a mall with my family, my parents, both my parents and my 4 older siblings, and we were walking through the mall, we were shopping, and I could feel it. I could feel like we were being stared at, and I'm looking around, and it's all the non-Indigenous people in that mall staring at me and my family. And they weren't staring at us in a very nice way. It was that hum, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Oh, these people again. It's that time. Like, you know, you kind of imagine or make up what they're thinking in their head, and you could feel it. Like, I could feel it. It wasn't just one person. It was like, and there was another time that I felt that. And I was 23, and it was in Saskatchewan, North Battleford. And I felt it walking down the street. And I, at this point in my life when I was 23, had worked very hard because I knew the stereotypes, I knew the negativity, I saw the looks, I knew very young how people looked at me and my family. And I love my family, I love my community, I love my parents. I look up to all of my elders, my community members, my aunts, my uncles, my parents. Like, I had huge family support systems in place that, you know, helped raise me to be who I am today. And I was proud of that. And so to be in a city at like 6 years old and seeing everybody looking down at you and your family, and you know that it's not in a good way, you feel that, you have to go your whole life growing up seeing that, feeling that, experiencing that. And it's hard. It's hard because, like, there are some people who make it and just, you know, they can strive and be successful, and there are other people who don't. And you see those people and you know how much potential they have, you know how good they are, you know how much of a difference they can make in people's lives if they really were given that opportunity. But you know, sometimes when you're rejected time and time after again, you're experiencing racism, violence, or whatever, it wears you down. And sometimes it's difficult to get back up. And that's what our Indigenous people face. And it's hard and it hurts. And you have to grieve. You have to, you know, go through a healing journey, and that's difficult for people to do. It's hard. And I'm fortunate enough to have had a lot of support systems in place, a lot of really wonderful aunts and uncles and grandparents who have been there and helped me, because they've all gone through it too. And, you know, it's given me the strength I needed to persevere and get through it all. But that hum is very loud and it echoes, and it's not easy. And I totally resonated with Lorralene and what you said about schooling, because that's how it was for me. I grew up on my First Nation Reserve, until grade 8. And then I went to high school in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Mm-hmm. And Sault Ste. Marie is another place in itself. But I also felt it there, like walking down the street. I was a total res kid, you know, used to cutting through lawns. I couldn't do that in the city. I had some old man yelling at me, screaming at me to get off of his lawn. And I was like, what's the big deal? Like, I didn't know. But I'm like, if you grew up on a reserve, you can cut through people's lawn, go through the field, cut through bush, no big deal. Nobody's going to yell at you. It's just land. But in the city, well, they're territorial. But those are just some of the experiences I've endured, you know, where I felt alienated. And I know for Sandi, Lorralene, myself, we have so much more to add to that.
I did just want to add one thing, and I'd be willing to bet that the other two can agree to this as well. There's always another side to the coin. You think that's one side, well, the other side isn't any better. And once you attain some level of success, all of a sudden you become the stick they beat other Indigenous people with, right? Well, if you made it, if they just worked harder, you were able to do it. Why can't they pull up their socks and do it? It is horrible. And we end up being used against our own, and it's gotta stop.
Absolutely. I think the main takeaway here is truly the importance of representation and the very disparity that exists in our society. I would like to also say that in our society, there's so much more that we could do to increase that representation and really show how much it matters, because at the end of the day, representation does matter. All of you are people of color, and most of the attendees tonight are as well. So having that representation speaks volumes. So I would like to commend all of you and thank you once again for sharing your thoughts. I could also add to that and say that even in our, whether it's in television, media, or if we ever do have that exposure to Indigenous individuals, I know that Samantha said that we don't see enough of them. I wanted to say that even if we do, I feel like they're often being misrepresented with the stereotypes that follow Indigenous people, and sort of in that sense, they perpetuate those stereotypes. And I won't say those stereotypes, I'm sure you're all too aware of them. But yeah, in my experience, I can 100% agree and say that we don't see enough of you guys. And that makes me sad, because you guys are wonderful. Like, just meeting you guys tonight, I'm sure the attendees feel the same. We need to see more of you guys and see your energy and hear about you guys. So yeah, I could agree with you there. I'll move on to our final question for the evening before we move on to our Q&A session with the attendees. And that question would be, I guess, for all of you, whoever wants to sound in first, feel free to. How can non-Indigenous individuals, such as myself and most of the attendees tonight, do our part in supporting the Indigenous?
I actually have a graphic to help with this one. So I am very much a visual learner. I find orally, I'm going to remember someone's words, it's going to resonate, but if I see an image as well, it's almost stamped into my memory. And because we're now talking about actions and things that need to happen, I just really wanted to up the chances of it actually happening. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Ignore any really scary stuff you see in the interim, guys. Can you, if I minimize that, whoops. Whoa, can you see that? Yes, awesome, it worked, you never know. Now, first off, I want to walk you through a little decolonizing exercise. We're not starting at the top, we're actually starting in the east where the new day begins. So I want to start on the right-hand side of this diagram. If you remember nothing else I say in the next 2 minutes, remember this, remember the rule, nothing for us or about us without us. If you are planning an event for Indigenous people, there has to be Indigenous people on your planning committee. If you want to help support an Indigenous community, that Indigenous community needs to be part of the planning. Don't do it for us, involve us. It is the only way. I see so many Canadians stressing themselves out, trying to know everything they're supposed to do. We are literally right there. Just ask us. We're standing right here, right? So nothing for us or about us without us. And by the way, that applies to every group. If you're working, trying to do something for youth, involve the youth. You're trying to do something for elders, involve the elders. It's just a great rule to live by. Next, further, and honestly, Mina, we didn't plan what she was just about to say, but it was like the perfect lead into my diagram. So the next point, look for us in your meetings and at your gatherings. And if we're not there, call that out and keep calling it out until we are. Because there are enough of us in this country, on our lands, still to this day, that we need to be in those meetings and at those gatherings. And if they're not, if we're not, it's because someone didn't have the connections and didn't know how to find us, and that's what needs to be fixed. We need to be there. We don't need people speaking for us. We have our own voices. Which brings me to the next point. Invite us to speak for ourselves. Do not dilute our truths and stories through your interpretation, which is going to happen through no fault of your own if you have a different cultural lens. It's about empowerment. It's about representation. We would not be in this mess if other people didn't think they knew what was in our best interest or just wanted us removed from the planet. So we have voices. We need to be invited to those rooms. The next one, equally as important, when we speak, listen. Listen as often as you can to our youth, to our elders, and our activists. You do not need to understand, but you need to believe that this is our truth. If I could get back all of the time that I've had to invest convincing someone that another entity or person was racist because they've never experienced racism at the hands of that person, they're not going to. It's one white person against another white person. They don't even know what that's like, but that doesn't mean what I've experienced is not true. This is our experience, and if you truly want to be an ally, you need to listen to what we say. The next one, allow or create space for the expression of Indigenous resilience as well as trauma. Do not discuss one without the other. Horrific things have happened to Indigenous people and continue to happen, and we're surviving them. We are still here. We are still laughing. We are still having our families. We are still trying to build bridges. I've traveled across Canada working in First Nations communities, and I've just never met more resilient people than Indigenous people, and that needs to be celebrated and recognized. And last but not least, the hardest one, and that's why I made it last. If you think of a beautiful eagle feather, which is everything to a Anishinaabe Kwe like me, think of on one side of the feather is us, Indigenous people, and the other side are non-Indigenous Canadians. If we get this together, that feather is going to heal, and we're going to fly to heights that we've never seen yet. But what I see way too often is non-Indigenous people wanting to cross to our side of the feather and help us. We can't heal if you don't help stop the attacks, because we're left in this perpetual state of having to heal. The non-Indigenous racists are on your side of the feather, and I know what I'm asking is not comfortable. But you need to shut those voices down. You need to say, not appropriate, not in this meeting. Please don't speak that way. You still get into rooms that we can't. And even if I was in the room and I spoke up against it, they don't hear me. Many non-Indigenous people still don't hear me, but if you're non-Indigenous, they do hear you. And that's how you heal your side of the feather. You have to call it out, because your silence is literally killing us. And this feather is never going to heal and be as strong as it could be until we stop the attacks. I know that was a lot in a few minutes, but that's how important this is to us. We are literally talking about our lives. I'm 57 years old. I'm more an activist than I've ever been before, because now I know my time is limited, and I'm trying to decide what world my grandchildren have to live in. I don't want them to inherit Canada the way it is. So we have work to do. Miigwech. Clapping. You guys are adorable. Would you like me to stop sharing the screen? Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandi, for sharing that incredibly informative graphic. I'm sure, I think it is important to acknowledge that as a non-Indigenous individual myself, and like many of the attendees tonight, we hold a huge responsibility in helping unsilence the silenced. And, and in that, as you mentioned, that would require having difficult conversations and really just challenging those people who choose to think otherwise. While it may be uncomfortable, I 100% agree that we bear that responsibility. And the only way to move forward and to really make that progressive change is to make that effort towards that. So thank you so much for sharing that. In that small amount of time that you had, you beautifully executed that, Sandi. So again, thank you so much. Samantha or Lorralene, would you like to add to that?
I don't want to take away from Sandi's wonderful ending, because I feel like she just hit the nail on the head. Like, it was perfect. And I can't really echo anything else except just educate yourself and do what Sandi said, you know, end the silence. You have a voice. You got to use it, because ours haven't been working.
Yep, same here. I'm like looking at my notes. I'm like, okay, Sandi hit that point. She hit that point. She hit that point. I'm like, good job on that. But yeah, it's just like the education, you know, and we were going back to kind of stereotypes in the media. There are a lot of Indigenous events that do happen in the GTA and in Toronto. For example, my roommate, he works at Imaginative. It's the largest Indigenous film festival in Toronto. And there's a lot of Indigenous filmmakers who are producing film today. And I think that's one thing, you know, like we also like celebrate these things too, you know, and use it as an opportunity to learn. We use that festival as a way to celebrate our Indigenous filmmakers and artists as well.
I just want, believe it or not, I have something else to add, like, Sandi, really? No, but I did want to say, because we touched on earlier, and I have this happen so often with so many different audiences, they're left thinking, now they're nervous to ask questions because they realize all we've been through, and I don't want to upset you, and maybe emotionally you're not in a good place today, so I don't want to ask. Again, quit babying us. Ask the question. If we're not emotionally able to, we will tell you we can't do that. The other thing you can keep in mind is if we're sitting on a panel, we've probably done enough of our healing journey to be able to handle your questions. You might not want to approach the person sitting at the bus stop because you don't know what they're dealing with right now, and maybe they have enough of a load. That's not the person to approach. But I mean, do a Google search, guys. There are Indigenous activists and authors and speakers out there. There are tons of YouTube videos out there. Pam Palmater does so much great work. So, I mean, just do your research and dare to ask the question. Get okay with hearing, I'm not comfy answering that question. Don't hold it against the person. Just accept that, okay, they're just being honest with me. Don't stop asking the question, though. Just go ask someone else. Awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Sandi, you really jumped the gun there. I was going to speak briefly, very briefly, on how I've even had to have difficult conversations within my own family, and I love how you incorporated that into the graphic and really shed light on the importance of not only having those conversations but taking the time to educate yourself. So beautifully said, all of you. I'd like to now open up the floor to a Q&A session for our attendees. If you guys have any questions for our panelists tonight, feel free to sound off in the chat. and they'll be answering your questions.
I had a question. First of all, everything. Oh, Assad. Okay. Well, I'll get my question real quick first. I'd like to first say everything you guys have said has been so insightful and knowledgeable, and I've learned so much about things that like I didn't even take in, like how hard it is for you to do like the normal things, just like go to see a doctor if you need to call a cop. Like, I think this panel really set in place like how hard and difficult it can be. And I know I heard Lorralene and Samantha, you guys talked about going to school on your reserve. I was really interested because I've heard a little bit about your education system on the reserves, and I don't believe you guys, even though we both went to public schools, I don't think we had the same opportunities. So I was just asking if you guys are comfortable like just sharing your experiences and like how it was on the reserve and like high school. And I believe Samantha, you went to elementary school.
I'll talk about my experience because I feel like Lorralene has a longer, because she went to high school there. For myself, growing up on the reserve, it's so I grew up with Kwamakonga unceded Indian reserve, the Indian territory. It's like not even Canada because it's a sovereign nation. So we basically don't have to follow provincial regulations in terms of our curriculum. So when I went to school all the way up into grade 8, my language was Anishinaabe. So I learned Anishinaabe from like, nursery school all the way up until, well, I learned it in high school too. But because I was like on reserve, we had a Ojibwe class every day for every grade of school. I went to school with all my cousins. So I had all my cousins were like my best friends. So I went to school with all of them. And it was nice because like nobody picked on you in the at school because you were Indigenous and everybody else there was Indigenous. So there was no like divide. Everybody kind of was, similar in where they came from. They're all learning the same languages, same culture, same like family sort of dynamic. And if anybody was trying to pick on you, you had all your cousins. They're like, that's my cousin. That's my cousin. Like, so it was like, I felt safe. I felt like taken care of. And it was hard though, because leaving that was hard. I didn't have my cousins when I went to high school. I didn't have, that community support, that knowledge and understanding of like Anishinaabe and culture, like I was taught with my culture. So like my 7 grandfather teachings, when we got detention, we didn't stay for an hour after school. We had to write out the Native Code of Ethics, however many times we got detention. So those 7 grandfather teachings really stick in your head when you get it 4 times in one day, because you have to write it out. Respect means to treat every human being from the tiniest, like all the way, like that was our detention. And it's not the same, because like the Native Code of Ethics instills like these values and morals within your, it's tied into your culture. Everything is interconnected. Everything is. And when you're getting detention all the time, because I was a bad kid, I ate gum and chewed candy in class. So I was really not sneaky about it. So I always got busted. So I got a lot of Native Code of Ethics writings behind my back. So that was my experience with going to school, and I enjoyed it. I liked it, and we did different things like art class. We learned about woodland style art. We had a community member come in and teach us how to do woodland art, and if you know about Anishinaabe culture, you would understand woodland art. There's a lot of like woodland artists, and their art is so beautiful. It's very spiritual. It's very like meaningful. It means something. Everything represents something. Everything is interconnected. And when you're painting and you're learning about the technique and you're learning about like the teachings behind all of it, it's you're not just looking at like a painting, you're looking at a teaching. you're looking at something that's way bigger than just, you know, a painting. It's all interconnected. It means so much. But those were the things that I was able to appreciate. And my aunts and uncles, all of them, knowing like seeing them in the community and stuff, that was comforting. Because then when you go to high school, your aunts and uncles aren't in the same community. Your cousins are not there. Your culture, the art, like some of them don't know. Teachers don't know. It's the tension I had to sit in after school in a room, and I just thought it was pointless. Like, to me, I would have rather did the Native Code of Ethics, because at least I was learning something. But that was my experience. I'll let Lorralene speak to her own.
Well, I never got caught, so I never had detention. Just kidding. No, my experience was good. It was pretty much the same too. And, you know, our schools are, so if the school that I went to was Mikanako-Nigaming, and it's a K-12 school. And I have siblings who are 10, 11 years younger than me. So I would go from upstairs, the high school area, to go visit them down in kindergarten or something. And the school is very community-based as well. So the school would like all get together one day to have a fall feast or a winter feast, spring feast. And, you know, the whole community comes. And one thing, yeah, I was taught Anishinaabe all the way up until it was, I don't know, your second language is required or whatever. I think it was like grade 10. So yeah, I was really, really strong in Anishinaabe, and the cool thing in high school, we got to take like classes that you wouldn't normally take at a public school. So there was a outdoor education class where we got to go on a 3-day canoe trip. We made wild rice. We harvested wild rice for the fall feast. We would go snowshoeing and snare and like do that kind of stuff. And so when I got to post-secondary, a lot like Samantha when she went to high school, and it was like school officer, but it was college, and I'm like, okay, all these skills that I learned at like within my community, yeah, they're good to have like when you're in your community. And yeah, I had my English, I had my math, whatever, you know, I had what you needed to have to graduate high school. But I'm like, how, like, those things are those other things that trapping, the harvesting, the, you know, being out on the land, connecting with the land, the language. And I'm like, how do you continue that into post-secondary within your studies to feel more connected? Because that's where I felt the disconnect the strongest. So that's kind of like one thing we're trying to work on at Humber as well, is like we're working on, well, when COVID is over, taking the students over to Curve Lake, for example, to do some wild racing or sugar bush, like maple sugaring. And just like doing stuff like that and like being more involved culturally. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I see here that Assad has a question as well. Assad, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I just had a question about a phrase that I remembered that I think Sandi repeated whenever she would conclude one of her sentences, and I'm not sure I quite caught what the phrase was.
What did
Maybe
I say
like,
this time?
maybe like when you're finished speaking, you're about to hand it off to someone.
Migret?
Yes, that's it.
Oh, it's a Ojibwe for thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all. Yeah.
Okay. And I was like, whoa. What did I say now? Like, yeah.
You're good.
Okay, so we are slightly over time. So if you do have to go, we understand. Otherwise, feel free to stay behind to hear more from our panelists in case anyone else does have any questions. You're welcome to ask it in the chat or unmute yourself just like Assad did. Okay, that may be it for our Q&A portion of the evening. Just to conclude, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists and attendees for attending this important yet difficult speaker series. We appreciate the panelists for taking the time to speak on these subjects, and we acknowledge that it was not easy for you to speak tonight, but on behalf of DECA Ryerson, we are grateful for this major learning opportunity. In closing, if any of you would like to make a donation in support of those affected by the residential schools, you can do so to the Legacy of Hope Foundation, a charity dedicated to educating and raising awareness about the impacts of residential school children in the form of educational tools and consultation with survivors. One of our exec members will be dropping a link to that in the chat. I would also like to add that here at DECA Ryerson, we will be making a donation of our own. So if you can, please consider donating as well, or continue to make efforts of your own towards increasing your own awareness on Indigenous issues. In addition, if any of you would like to reach out or connect with any of the panelists tonight, whether it's through LinkedIn or through any of the links provided in the chat, feel free to check the chat for those links posted. Otherwise, thank you to our panelists and attendees for coming out tonight. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Miigwech.
Thank you, everybody. Miigwech.
Yep, make glad to everyone.